Ethan Martell had never planned to return to the old property, but after years of moving between rented apartments and restless jobs, the quiet expanse of his grandfather's land in northern Oregon began to feel less like a burden and more like a promise. The fields had long turned wild, the fences sagged under ivy, and the once straight tractor path that wound toward the southern slope was now a blur of weeds and half-buried stones. He arrived in early autumn, when the soil was still warm underfoot, and the sky had that hazy copper tone that made everything look older than it was. For Ethan, the decision to restore the place wasn't about nostalgia or sentimentality. It was about reclaiming something tangible, a fragment of family history that hadn't yet been swallowed by paperwork and debt. The first weeks passed in a steady rhythm of work and silence. He cleared out the collapsed barn, replaced warped boards on the porch, and spent his evenings sitting on the back steps with a thermos of coffee, listening to the crickets. There was a sense of private triumph in the routine, the feeling of building something steady after years of transience. The locals kept to themselves. The nearest house belonged to a man named Ross Crane, a tall, heavy-set neighbor whose property bordered Ethan's on the west side. They met once, briefly, when Ethan stopped by to ask about the shared road that split from the main county lane. Ross had been polite, even friendly in a distant way, promising to keep the lane open while construction work continued on his side. It seemed harmless at the time. When Ethan decided to reopen the old tractor path, his grandfather's original access to the lower acres, he expected it to be a simple matter of cutting back undergrowth and regrading the soil. The morning he brought the rented tractor onto the property, the air smelled of wet pine and rust. He followed the faint depression of the old road until it curved toward the tree line, and then stopped. What should have been an open passage toward his southern boundary ended abruptly in a line of concrete and shadow. A large structure, a garage, maybe 20 feet wide, sat squarely across the path, its corrugated metal siding catching the sun like a blade. Two vehicles were parked beside it, a red pickup and a silver SUV, both coated in dust but clearly in use. A chain stretched between two steel posts, blocking the way entirely, with a bright orange sign hanging from it. Private property. No access. For a moment, Ethan thought he had taken the wrong direction. He walked closer, scanning the familiar landmarks, the birch tree his grandfather once trimmed, the stone marker near the ditch. It was unmistakable. This was his land. He felt a peculiar pressure in his chest, not anger at first, but a kind of stunned disbelief, the realization that something had quietly shifted in his absence. He pulled out his grandfather's old map from the glove compartment of the truck and unfolded it across the hood. The faint ink lines showed the same path, running straight through the southern parcel toward a creek bed beyond the ridge. The garage didn't exist on any record. It was as if the boundary itself had been rewritten while no one was watching. Ethan stood there for a long while, the idle hum of the tractor behind him, the forest thick with late-season insects, trying to make sense of how a man could build an entire structure over someone else's road, and no one, no county inspector, no neighbor, not even the real estate office that had processed the inheritance, had noticed. When he finally climbed back into the truck, a quiet, simmering unease followed him. On the way back, he passed Ross's property. The man was standing near his fence line, talking on the phone, his expression unreadable. For a brief second their eyes met, and Ross gave a small, almost cordial nod. It was the kind of gesture that could mean anything: courtesy, indifference, or a warning that he already knew why Ethan had come down that road. Ethan spent the following days pacing around the property with a sense of quiet irritation that refused to fade. The garage on the southern edge had become an unspoken presence, looming at the edge of his thoughts no matter what he tried to focus on. He had intended to keep things simple: repair the fence line, level the old shed, plant winter rye before the first frost. But now every task seemed pointless, until he understood what had happened to his road. On the third morning, he drove into town to request the official parcel map from the county records office. The clerk, a polite woman with a practiced smile, printed out the current cadastral layout and handed it to him over the counter. Ethan unfolded it, his eyes scanning the grid lines and coordinates, and his stomach dropped. The section where his grandfather's tractor path should have been marked was shaded gray, labeled Pending Boundary Review, Disputed Access. It wasn't a mistake in printing. Someone had filed a formal notice challenging the exact strip of land where the garage now stood. The notation included a code and date. Subdivision Adjustment Request, filed 18 months prior. Ethan looked up from the map and asked who had initiated the request. The woman hesitated, then shrugged apologetically. "That's a private filing, sir. We can only release that information through a legal records request." He left the office with the papers rolled under his arm, feeling as if the ground beneath the property had quietly shifted while he wasn't looking. When he got back, the air felt heavier. The sun was low behind the pines, and the faint smell of motor oil drifted from the direction of Ross Crane's property. Ethan walked the length of the fence until he reached the chained-off section of road again. The vehicles were gone, but the garage door was open, revealing shelves stacked with boxes, old tires, and, at the back, a set of concrete mix bags still sealed. Ross wasn't home, yet the way the space was organized suggested permanence. This wasn't a temporary structure built by mistake. It was an installation rooted in ownership. A small mailbox beside the gate bore a printed label, Lot 52B, Crane Holdings, LLC. Ethan froze. His parcel was registered as 52A. The difference of a single letter felt like an insult carved into the landscape. He took photos of the boundary markers and returned to his truck, his pulse tightening. That night, he called the county again, determined to at least understand the procedure. A man from the zoning department explained, in a tone both flat and unhurried, that when a piece of land is left unused or unmaintained for more than 15 years, a neighboring party can file a conditional use claim if they have improved the area for practical purposes, grading, construction, drainage, or utility access. If the claim remains unchallenged for 12 consecutive months, the disputed section becomes eligible for jurisdiction review. Ethan listened in silence, realizing with a slow, sick clarity that he had walked straight into a bureaucratic ambush. Ross hadn't simply built his garage on someone else's land. He had laid the groundwork for a legal takeover years in advance. The next morning, Ethan hired an independent surveyor to confirm the boundary. The man, older, with a sunburned neck and a tape measure that clicked like a metronome, spent the afternoon marking points with orange flags. When he finished, his expression was grim. "You're right," he said. "That building sits 3.5 meters inside your line. But here's the catch. The county registry now lists the coordinates from Crane's last filing as the provisional standard. It's messy. It'll take months to untangle." Ethan asked if there was anything he could do immediately. The man shook his head. "Unless you can prove deliberate fraud, it's just paperwork. You can't touch that structure without a legal order. Do that, and you'll be the one in violation." Ethan thanked him, though the words tasted hollow. He watched the man's truck disappear down the dirt road, then turned toward the garage again, the gray metal glinting through the trees like a taunt. By evening, a storm had rolled in from the coast, rattling the windows and flooding the field, and in that restless sound of rain, Ethan began to feel the first curl of anger beneath the confusion. He spent hours at the table, going through old folders his grandfather had kept, deeds, letters, property tax receipts, everything yellowed and fragile. He found one envelope dated 1984, addressed to the county planning board, where his grandfather had protested the idea of merging the lower lots under any corporate zoning claim. The letter had never been answered. At the bottom, the old man had written in pencil, "Boundaries hold only as long as someone remembers them." The following morning, Ethan drove to Ross's house. The neighbor was outside, wearing work gloves and hosing down the concrete near the garage. "Morning," Ross called, his tone too bright to be sincere. "Everything all right?" Ethan held up the county map and the printout from the survey. "You built this over my land," he said. "I need you to move those vehicles and take down the gate." Ross stopped spraying and leaned on the hose, squinting at him. That so? Funny thing, the map I've got says otherwise. He nodded toward his office window. Filed and approved 2 years ago. Maybe you should keep your paperwork current. Ethan's jaw tightened. You know that claim isn't legitimate. Ross smiled faintly. Then prove it. He dropped the hose and walked inside, the screen door slamming behind him. That night, Ethan received an email from the county legal office confirming the existence of an active boundary suspension order tied to both properties. Until further review, neither party could make alterations, removals, or access adjustments on the contested area. In simpler terms, Ethan couldn't even step onto the road that was legally his. Any violation could result in fines or criminal trespass charges. The message was signed by a paralegal with a neutral farewell. We appreciate your patience during this process. Ethan sat in the half-dark of his kitchen, staring at the glow of the screen. Outside, the wind swept through the empty field, bending the tall grass like waves. He imagined the road, his grandfather's path, quiet under the rain, chained and forgotten, the garage standing over it like a tombstone. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about the slow suffocation of something his family had built with hands and sweat, a history rewritten in official ink while he was busy living somewhere else. He closed the laptop, the decision forming before he had words for it. If the system was designed to bury people like him under paperwork, then he would start digging in the opposite direction. Ethan tried to convince himself that the situation could still be solved through patience and reason, but each day that passed made that belief harder to hold. What began as an awkward boundary mix-up was slowly turning into something calculated, something Ross seemed to enjoy watching unfold. At first, Ethan kept his distance, focusing on the repairs inside the house, telling himself he wouldn't give the man the satisfaction of open confrontation. But avoidance turned into paralysis, because everything that mattered on his property lay beyond that locked chain. The southern slope held the best soil, the old well, and the space he had planned to use for a new barn. Every morning he looked out over the field and felt the same cold frustration. His land, visible yet unreachable. On the 5th day, he found fresh tire tracks cutting across his field, the imprints deep and deliberate, leading from Ross's driveway to the edge of the restricted road. A large plastic container labeled gravel fill sat in the middle of the path, as if placed there to assert control. It wasn't enough that Ross had stolen space. He was now marking it, staking it like a conqueror. Ethan photographed everything. Though he wasn't sure for whom, no one at the county office seemed interested, and his own emails went unanswered, except for the automated acknowledgement that his complaint was under review. That afternoon, he walked to Ross's gate again, determined to speak face to face, to at least demand an explanation that sounded human. The garage door was half open, and the sound of a radio echoed from inside. Classic rock turned up too loud, deliberately so. Ross emerged, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, smiling as though nothing were wrong. "You're persistent," he said, almost admiringly. Ethan held out a printed copy of the Surveyors report. "You know this shows the garage is on my property line. I'm not asking you again. Move your vehicles, take down the chain, and let me through." Ross studied him for a moment, then tossed the rag onto the hood of the truck. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that," he said. "But spirit doesn't mean much without standing." Ethan frowned. "Standing?" Ross gestured vaguely toward the field. "Legal standing. I've had this access for years. The county knows it, the registry knows it, and every month that road sits untouched, it becomes more mine than yours." His tone carried no hostility, only calm assurance, the voice of a man who had already won. When Ethan didn't respond, Ross added almost casually, "If it bothers you that much, rent it. $800 a month, renewable contract. I'll even throw in snow maintenance. Think of it as me being neighborly." Ethan felt his pulse rise. "You're trespassing on my land, and you're asking me to pay you for it?" Ross's smile didn't waver. Call it compensation for keeping it in shape. He turned back to his tools, signaling the conversation was over. Ethan stood there, breathing through clenched teeth, and then walked away before his temper could catch up to him. That evening, a delivery truck pulled into his driveway. The driver asked for Ross Crane but was holding Ethan's address. On the manifest, the listed drop point was Lot 52B South Access, Construction Materials. The man shrugged, apologizing. Guess they mixed it up again. He left the container, a heavy steel crate, on Ethan's gravel pad and drove off. Ethan stared at it, realizing that this mix-up wasn't a mistake at all. Each wrong delivery, each mislabeled map, each quiet administrative slip was a step in the same direction, a gradual rewriting of reality until everyone believed that Ross's claim was legitimate. By morning, another notice appeared in Ethan's mailbox. Unauthorized placement of commercial equipment, property inspection scheduled. He hadn't even touched the crate. He began documenting everything meticulously, photos, timestamps, copies of every email, but it felt like throwing pebbles into an ocean of indifference. The officials he spoke to on the phone were polite but evasive, using phrases like ongoing evaluation and jurisdictional ambiguity. One even suggested he might want to reach an amicable understanding with the adjacent claimant to avoid prolonged litigation. Ethan hung up before he could say something he'd regret. That night he sat at the table under the single lamp, surrounded by papers, and finally admitted what he had been avoiding. This wasn't an accident of bureaucracy. It was a process engineered by someone who knew exactly how the system worked. A week later, things took a sharper turn. A white SUV appeared on the gravel road near dusk, stopping at the edge of Ethan's property. Two men got out, both wearing high-visibility vests marked Property Assessment. They didn't knock. They walked straight to the southern boundary, unrolled measuring tape, and began taking photos of Ross's garage. Ethan approached, asking what they were doing. One of them, without looking up, said, "Routine evaluation for the pending review. Standard protocol." Ethan demanded to see authorization, but the man simply nodded toward the chain and said, "We're operating within Crane's jurisdiction zone." The way he said it, Crane's jurisdiction, felt like a slap. When they left, Ross was waiting near the corner of the road, arms folded, pretending to check his phone. As the SUV pulled away, he looked up at Ethan and said quietly, "You shouldn't make this harder than it needs to be." Then he smiled, that same small, knowing curve of his mouth, and walked back toward his property. Ethan stood there in the fading light, the sound of cicadas rising behind him, realizing that whatever was happening wasn't just legal maneuvering anymore. It was pressure, psychological, economic, social, a slow tightening of a noose. He called the surveyor again, but this time the man's tone was different, hesitant. "Look, Mr. Martell," he said, "I got a call from the registry asking about my report. They want clarification on the boundary points, which means they're reconsidering the coordinates. If that happens, your side could be redrawn on paper even before a hearing. I'm sorry, but it's out of my hands." Ethan thanked him quietly, though he felt a chill in his gut. It wasn't just that Ross was powerful or connected. It was that he had turned the dull machinery of paperwork into a weapon, one that cut without ever drawing blood. By the end of the month, Ethan noticed new stakes hammered into the soil along the fence line, bright red plastic markers with tags reading Temporary Survey Point, Do Not Disturb. They ran straight across the field, slicing through his garden and stopping a few feet short of the house. The message couldn't have been clearer. The fight had moved closer. The red stakes stayed where they were, bright as warning flares in the pale morning light. Ethan tried not to look at them, but their presence was inescapable, cutting his land into neat, artificial fragments that seemed to mock the notion of ownership. Days blurred into a slow grind of waiting for calls that never came, and letters that only deepened his confusion. The county office promised updates. The zoning board assured him that all parties were being heard, But each new communication carried the same hollow phrasing, the same suggestion that this was simply the natural course of administrative due process. The problem was, the process itself was devouring him. He'd stopped sleeping properly, waking in the early hours to walk the property line with a flashlight, not out of fear, but a need to confirm that it still existed. Each night he found something new: a measuring rod left near the gate, a survey ribbon fluttering from a branch, once even a tire track veering dangerously close to the porch. He took photos of it all, even though he no longer believed evidence mattered. What use was proof in a system that rewarded those who manipulated the definitions of proof itself? In late November, a letter arrived that changed everything. The envelope bore the seal of a private land consulting firm called Northline Infrastructure, a name Ethan didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice of a proposed access reallocation agreement. The document stated that due to historical inconsistencies in local land divisions, Northline had been contracted to assess viable use corridors across adjoining parcels for potential infrastructure improvement. It was written in language so polished it almost sounded harmless. Phrases like optimizing rural connectivity and cooperative land efficiency. But buried in the middle of the dense text was the clause that made Ethan's throat tighten. The existing secondary access road, Parcel 52A South, may be subject to reclassification under multi-user jurisdiction for non-exclusive utility and transit purposes. In other words, his private road, his grandfather's road, could be redefined as shared infrastructure, and Ross's garage, sitting directly across that route, would suddenly stand as a legitimate structure bordering a public right-of-way. Ethan read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table, feeling the first true pulse of dread since this had begun. That night, rain came again, hard and cold, slashing against the windows. He sat by the wood stove, the map spread across his knees, tracing the original boundaries with a dull pencil, trying to picture how easily the past could be erased with a few updated coordinates. His grandfather's handwriting still marked the edge of the southern field, a careful note in faded blue ink that read, "Do not alter grade near the ridge, old well beneath." That line had once been a practical instruction. Now it felt like a warning. The well lay under Ross's garage. The next morning, Ethan drove 2 towns over to meet a private land surveyor who'd been recommended by a friend of his late father. The man's name was Walter Drake, an independent contractor with gray stubble and sharp eyes that had seen too many property disputes to be impressed by bureaucracy. They met in a diner near the highway, over black coffee and the kind of weather talk that served as armor against suspicion. When Ethan laid out the papers, Walter took his time reading, then nodded slowly. "You're not dealing with a mistake," he said finally. "This is orchestrated. Northline Infrastructure doesn't handle farm disputes. They handle pre-acquisition studies. That means someone's positioning your land for a larger deal." Ethan frowned, not understanding. Walter leaned forward. "These consultants don't care about fences or garages. They work for investment groups, shell companies that buy rural tracts cheap before they're rezoned for industry or residential development. Once they can prove overlapping access rights, they can claim the land was never truly private to begin with." Ethan sat back, the pieces falling into place with nauseating clarity. Ross wasn't simply fighting for a few meters of dirt. He was facilitating a takeover. He probably wasn't even acting alone. Walter agreed to conduct a confidential resurvey using original plats from the 1970s, before any digital adjustments had been made. They spent 2 full days on the land, moving through the cold, misty air with instruments that beeped softly in the distance. Walter was meticulous, working from handwritten coordinates Ethan's grandfather had kept. By the second evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he handed Ethan a small notepad. "These are your real lines," he said. "And here's the kicker. The official county database doesn't match them. Somebody entered altered data in the last 2 years. It's subtle, but it shifts your southern boundary by exactly 12 feet. That's enough to move your road under Crane's claimed zone." He paused, lowering his voice. That's data manipulation, not an oversight. Someone got paid for this. Ethan stared at the numbers until they blurred. The truth was vindicating, but also terrifying. Proving a falsified entry in county records would mean accusing officials of collusion, a near-impossible task without direct evidence. Walter agreed to prepare an affidavit, though he warned it might not carry much weight. Courts love paperwork more than truth, he said, but it's a start. 2 nights later, Ethan found Ross standing near the shared fence under the weak glow of a motion light. The man looked calm, almost casual, a cigarette burning between his fingers. You've been busy, Ross said softly. Bringing in outsiders, digging through old maps. It's impressive, really. But I should warn you, it doesn't end well for people who dig too deep. His voice wasn't overtly threatening. It was matter of fact, like a weather report. Ethan stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated. You're not going to scare me off my own land. Ross exhaled smoke, watching it curl upward like something deliberate. It's not about fear, Ethan. It's about fatigue. Most people don't fight long enough to see how pointless it is. He flicked the cigarette into the mud, the ember dying instantly, then walked back toward the garage. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The house seemed to hum with tension, every creak of wood sounding like movement outside. Just after midnight, headlights swept briefly across the far field, then vanished. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, but there was nothing except the lingering smell of exhaust. The next morning, he found new tire tracks leading up to the chain. The padlock had been replaced, new, shiny, and stamped with an unfamiliar brand. By December, Walter sent him a digital copy of the resurvey and a note, filed under your name, keep multiple backups. But when Ethan tried to register the affidavit with the county clerk, the submission portal returned an error. Document already exists under associated parcel claim. Someone had preempted his filing. The digital footprint had been overwritten. It was as if his version had never existed. Ethan stood outside his house, looking over the land that no longer felt like his. He thought about the years his grandfather had spent clearing stones by hand, the winters when the road froze solid, and how every inch of it had once meant effort, not paperwork. Now it was reduced to pixels, lines, codes, something that could be edited out of existence. For the first time, the idea of walking away crossed his mind, but it came with an aftertaste of shame so bitter it hardened into resolve. Maybe Ross was right about fatigue. Maybe the system was too heavy to move. But Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he left, the story would end exactly the way Ross had planned, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. That night, as the wind tore through the trees, he packed a folder with the original maps, Walter's notes, and the letter from Northline. He didn't have a plan yet, only an instinct that something deeper was hiding behind all this legality. The garage wasn't just an eyesore, it was a symbol, a marker of what people like Ross believed they could do when no one stood in their way. And if the law refused to protect what was his, Ethan would find another way to make it remember. The first real snow of the season came early that year, laying a thin, deceptive calm over the land. To anyone passing by, Ethan's property looked peaceful, a postcard of winter stillness with its pale fields and low smoke from the chimney. But inside the house, the tension had grown so taut, it felt like something humming beneath the walls. The boundary dispute had reached a stage where every action, every letter, every quiet knock on the door carried weight. Ethan received an official court summons, not from Ross directly, but from a firm representing him, Harlan and Pierce Real Property Advocates, accusing Ethan of unlawful interference with established access rights and defamation of property integrity. The phrasing was absurd, yet the implications were severe. If the court accepted the argument, Ross could not only keep the garage where it stood, but also gain partial control over the adjoining strip of land as protective buffer. It was a masterstroke of legal predation, The man who had built over Ethan's property was now claiming to be the one under threat. Ethan's attorney, a pragmatic woman named Leah Quinn, met him in her office a few days later. She had the weary posture of someone who had seen too many small landowners crushed by procedural weight. After reading through the documents, she removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. "He's using the adverse use doctrine," she said quietly. "If he can prove consistent, uncontested occupation or maintenance for more than a decade, the law tilts in his favor. And judging by this paperwork, he's been preparing for that claim for a long time." Ethan leaned forward, frustration seeping into his voice. "But he altered county data. We have proof of that. Walter's affidavit, the old maps." Leah shook her head. "We have suggestions of tampering, not proof admissible in court. The altered coordinates appear legitimate on the state database, which means they'll stand unless you can connect them to a specific act of fraud. Without an internal whistleblower or digital log, it's circumstantial." She paused, studying him. "You need to understand, Ethan. This isn't just about land anymore. It's about precedent. If they win here, the firm representing Crane can use this case to justify dozens of similar claims across the county." The idea that his personal loss could serve as a model for someone else's theft made Ethan's stomach twist. Leah promised to file a counterclaim asserting historical possession and fraudulent adjustment, but she warned that it would be a slow, grinding process. "These cases don't move on truth," she said. "They move on endurance." In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere around the property darkened. The quiet became oppressive, not peaceful, and Ethan began to notice subtle signs that someone wanted him to give up. Twice he found fresh footprints near the side of the house, leading toward the shed, though there was no sign of forced entry. The electricity flickered intermittently at night. Once, when he came home from town, he found the gate at the end of the drive slightly ajar, though he was sure he'd locked it that morning. None of these things were overtly threatening. They were worse than that. They were deliberate reminders that the boundaries, both physical and psychological, were no longer his alone. One night, unable to sleep, he went out to the southern field with a flashlight. The air was still, the snow crunching under his boots. As he reached the chain blocking the old road, the beam caught something glinting near the base of the post, a small brass plate screwed into the metal, freshly polished. It read, "Easement Zone 52B, maintained by Crane Holdings, LLC." He stared at it for a long moment, the words blurring as anger flooded through him. It wasn't enough for Ross to own the space. He had to brand it, to make it official in the eyes of anyone who happened to look. Ethan ripped the plate off, the screws snapping, and threw it into the snow. For the first time since the dispute began, the thought of retaliation crossed his mind, not in violence, but in exposure. He would find out who was funding Ross, who was behind Northline Infrastructure, who was rewriting the maps. The next morning, Ethan drove to the county office without an appointment. He waited nearly an hour before being ushered into the assistant clerk's cubicle. The young man behind the desk looked nervous when Ethan mentioned the parcel number. "Sir, I can't discuss active disputes," he said, his eyes darting toward the hallway. Ethan leaned closer. "Then tell me this. Who approved the boundary suspension in the first place? It wasn't filed by Ross Crane. The document came from a third-party entity. Who signed it?" The clerk hesitated, lowering his voice. "You didn't hear it from me, but the authorization came from a state-level contractor, Environmental Transit Group. They handle infrastructure assessments. They work with Northline sometimes." Ethan's mind reeled. A state-affiliated contractor meant political protection. It wasn't just one corrupt neighbor. It was a coordinated chain where every link served the next. That evening, Leah called to warn him that the opposing side had filed an injunction to prevent any modification of the disputed land, including unauthorized soil disturbance. The irony was almost grotesque. He couldn't even shovel his own snow without risking a violation. But when she mentioned one more detail, that Ross had requested the right to install a security fence for safety reasons, Ethan felt something inside him snap. A fence would make the annexation permanent in every visible sense. It would tell the world, this is settled, this is his. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed new trucks coming and going from Ross's property. Contractors, survey vehicles, even a small excavator. The metallic rattle of digging began early each morning, echoing across the frozen field like a slow heartbeat. When he confronted one of the workers, the man shrugged. "We've got the permits, sir. Temporary installation, per the township directive." Ethan laughed bitterly. The township directive. That phrase sounded like a spell designed to turn theft into policy. Then, one night near the end of December, the inevitable happened. A fire broke out near the old shed behind Ethan's house, the dry boards catching like tinder. He managed to extinguish it before it spread, but the smoke filled the air for hours. The next morning, 2 deputies arrived, not to investigate the fire, but to deliver a warning about unauthorized burning. Someone had reported him. The report included photos, close-up, clear, and taken from an angle that could only have come from Ross's property. The message was unmistakable. He was being watched. By now, the snow had hardened into a crust over the fields, glittering like glass under the pale sun. The world looked motionless, but underneath it, everything was shifting. Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. Not resignation, but focus. They wanted him to feel powerless, but there were still truths left to uncover. He had Walter's notes, the clerk's whispered admission, the overlapping company names. Somewhere in that tangle was the thread that would unravel the whole scheme, and for the first time, he was ready to pull it, no matter what it cost. January arrived heavy and gray, the kind of cold that seemed to thicken the air and dull the sound of everything living. Ethan had stopped expecting fairness. He wanted only one thing now, to make the truth undeniable, even to a system designed to ignore it. Leah had managed to secure an emergency hearing, arguing that the ongoing construction violated the injunction's neutrality clause. The court scheduled it for the 12th, a small victory that felt fragile from the start. In the week leading up to it, Ross moved fast. The contractors erected a chain-link fence along the disputed road, complete with motion lights and a freshly poured concrete base. Each addition was a provocation, a calculated move to remind Ethan how little control he had left. He took photos every day, his hands numb from the cold, documenting every stage like a man chronicling the dismantling of his own home. The night before the hearing, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark kitchen surrounded by folders and printouts, Walter's survey, the clerk's whispered lead, Leah's motions, and one new piece of evidence he hadn't shared with anyone yet. 2 days earlier, while helping Walter retrieve archived survey data, he had found an older version of the county's digital map buried in a forgotten subfolder. The file contained revision metadata showing the name of the user who had entered the adjusted coordinates 2 years ago. R. Crane, external consultant, Northline Infrastructure. Ethan had stared at the screen for a long time, almost unable to process what he was seeing. Ross hadn't just exploited the loophole. He had literally rewritten the boundaries himself, using a consultant's login he was never authorized to access. It was the smoking gun. The only question was whether it would still mean anything once exposed. When he arrived at the courthouse, the sky hung low and colorless, the kind of day that pressed down on the spirit. Ross stood near the entrance, his lawyer beside him, both dressed in tailored black. Their calmness was unnerving, as though the outcome had already been decided. Inside, the hearing room was small, its fluorescent light too harsh, its silence too clean. Leah opened with quiet precision, presenting the photographs, the affidavit, and the new metadata file. She spoke evenly, letting the weight of each point rest in the still air before moving to the next. Ross's attorney countered with the usual choreography of dismissal, claims of data misinterpretation, procedural delays, jurisdictional boundaries. But when Leah projected the screen capture showing Ross's name embedded in the coordinate log, a subtle shift rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward, frowning, asking for clarification. The attorney stumbled, explaining that consultant logins were sometimes shared for expediency, but the tone of certainty had vanished. For the first time in months, Ethan felt the current change direction. The judge ordered an immediate verification of the metadata and questioned whether Northline's role had been properly disclosed during the prior hearings. Ross sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table. The illusion of confidence cracked just slightly, but it was enough. The judge suspended all active construction permits and issued a temporary injunction against further occupation of the disputed area pending a formal audit. Leah's hand closed briefly over Ethan's wrist under the table, a gesture that carried both relief and exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up, sharp and dry, scraping through the bare branches like wire. Ross approached him, alone now. No lawyer, no witnesses. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ross said quietly, "You don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about you and me. You pulled a thread that goes through people you don't even see." His tone was calm, but his eyes had that cold, animal alertness of someone cornered. Ethan met his gaze and answered softly, "Then let them pull back." Ross gave a short laugh that wasn't amusement so much as disbelief, then turned and walked toward his truck without another word. That night, Ethan drove home through falling snow, the headlights carving tunnels of light through the darkness. The fence still stood there, cutting across the road like a scar, but for the first time it looked temporary, brittle, something that could be dismantled. The court order had frozen everything in place. No one could build, dig, or claim ownership until the audit concluded. He stood by the fence for a long time, his breath misting in the cold, and felt a strange combination of victory and weariness. He hadn't won yet, but for the first time, Ross had lost his certainty, and that was enough to make the silence feel lighter. Inside the house, Ethan set the folder on the table and poured himself a drink. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, burying the tire tracks, the footprints, even the red survey stakes. For months the land had been divided by numbers and greed, but under the white, perfect stillness, it belonged to no one. He watched it disappear inch by inch, until all that remained was the quiet hum of the furnace and the faint glow of dawn beginning to rise behind the trees, the first light that felt, however briefly, like a reprieve. Spring came late that year, slow and reluctant, the thaw creeping across the ground like something uncertain of its welcome. By then, the audit had concluded, confirming what Ethan already knew. The coordinate data had been falsified, and Ross Crane's authorization to act as an external consultant had been fabricated through Northline's internal access chain. The company issued a carefully worded statement about administrative miscommunication, but the state's legal department referred the matter for criminal review. Ross disappeared within a week, his house emptied overnight, the garage door left hanging open as if he'd been halfway through packing when he realized the game was over. Ethan didn't celebrate. He walked the property instead, tracing the edge of the old road with his hand, feeling the brittle frost under his fingers. The fence came down in April, dismantled by a county crew who moved efficiently but without conversation, as though they wanted to erase every trace of what had been there. When the last post was gone, the road looked smaller than he remembered, humble, almost fragile, yet it seemed to breathe again. In the months that followed, Ethan rebuilt slowly. He planted clover to stabilize the soil and filled the gaps in the fence line where the red stakes had once stood. Neighbors began stopping by, not to pry, but to talk in quiet, cautious tones, as if they too had learned something from watching him hold his ground. One older man told him that 2 other families in the county had discovered similar boundary shifts, both traced back to the same firm. The revelation didn't bring satisfaction, only a deeper understanding of how easily silence could turn into surrender. By early summer, the land had settled into its old rhythm. The road was open, the air smelled of grass and machinery, and the sound of Ethan's tractor carried through the valley like an old voice returning. He didn't think of victory, He thought of persistence, of the stubborn weight of things that refused to vanish simply because someone else decided they should. When he reached the end of the road, he stopped and looked back at the house, small against the horizon, steady and unremarkable, yet standing exactly where it belonged. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet not as absence, but as proof that something had endured.